think we can start. Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody.
We can start.
Wherever you are.
Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Wherever you are. Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody.
What's happening?
You are. Hello and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. What's happening?
I think somebody's got some feedback here.
Dr. Baabood, do you have some? Do you have it opened on another browser? Dr. Baabood, do you have some? Do you have it opened on another browser?
Let me check.
Dr. Baabood, do you have some? Do you have it opened on another browser?
Is it better now?
Yes, the echo is, yeah.
Okay. All right. Apologize about this technical issue. So said good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, and you're all most welcome to join us, and thank you for joining us on this very important event titled Resetting Iran-GCC Relation. Is it for real or is it real? As you know, since early 2021, there has been a de-escalation efforts and dialogue that has been accelerating between Iran and its GCC member states, especially with Saudi Arabia and also the United Arab Emirates. And we have seen that over the past year, Riyadh and Tehran have been conducting several rounds of talks in Baghdad, and also the United Arab Emirates has demonstrated willingness to de-escalate with Tehran. And in spite, of course, of the growing outreach to Tel Aviv and the signing of the Abraham Accord in mid-2020, and there is a talk of exchange of ambassadors. Other GCC states have also kept their relations with Iran, particularly Qatar, Oman, and Qatar played very important regional mediation to host the talks between Washington and Tehran. Kuwait continues to balance its relation with Tehran, and of course, Oman kept preserving its excellent relations with all sides. And this has been demonstrated by hosting the Iranian leader, Ebrahim Raisi, recently in Muscat. However, despite all these activities and regional de-escalation, Iran and Saudi Arabia have so far not reached any meaningful accommodation. The negotiations between the two regional powers appear to still be exclusively focused on security issues rather than political or inclusive cooperation. And we have not seen much in terms of restoring diplomatic ties. Now, the tangible benefits, of course, for the Gulf states dialogue with Iran also remains unclear, and so as the outcomes of the discussion, which could be affected by the ongoing events such as the success or failure of the JCPOA nuclear negotiations in Vienna. What are the current tensions between the GCC and Iran, and what are the prospects of their de-escalation in the near future? What regional or global events, such as the JCPOA negotiation or a new confrontation between Iran and Israel, could affect the outcome of Iran-GCC talks? What have intra-GCC relations shaped these dialogues, and are the discussions best understood in regional context or as part of a broader rapprochement, or simply as individual states attempting to preserve their own interests? This is something that we will try, and with the help of distinguished speakers that GIF has assembled here, we try to disentangle. Of course, you know that GIF is an independent non-profit institute that aims primarily to be a source of objective analysis on the Gulf region, and it hosts talks and roundtable discussions on social, political, and economic and geopolitical issues in the Gulf. I also want to welcome our speakers here, and I'll go by the order of speaking. First, want to welcome Alex Vatanka, who's of course well-known Iran specialist. He's the founder, director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute, and he specializes in the Middle Eastern regional security affairs with a particular focus on Iran. He was formerly senior analyst at James Information Group in London. Alex is also senior fellow at the Middle East Studies at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School at Herbert Field, and teaches as an adjunct professor at DISAS at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Following that order, I also would like to welcome Dr. Ali AlKandari, who's a history professor at Kuwait University. Ali specializes in Islamist movement, social transformation, and contemporary history of the Gulf. And he holds a master degree of arts in Arab studies from Georgetown University, and received his PhD from the University of Exeter in 2014 in Arabic and Islamic studies. Last but not least, I also would like to welcome Professor Danielle Pletka, who is a distinguished senior fellow in foreign and defense studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on U.S. foreign policy in general, and also in the Middle East in particular. Until January 2020, Pletka had was the senior vice president of foreign and defense policy studies at AEI, and she's currently teaching at the U.S. Middle East Policy at Georgetown University Walsh School of Foreign Service. So within this panel, we will have the speakers speaking in the order that I've just presented them. Their bios, a longer bio is available on the website. And let me just turn first to our first speaker, Alex. I wanted to ask you, Alex, this. Iran had called for regional dialogue for many years. The Hormuz Initiative, etc. What concessions do you think that Iran, that could be acceptable to Tehran, that could lower the tension with its Gulf neighbors? And if we want to follow on from that, from Iran's perspective, what steps should Riyadh, Manama, Abu Dhabi, other Gulf states, if you like, take to lower regional tension and ease Iranian security concerns? And how would the GCC-Iran détente differ with or without a nuclear, reaching a nuclear deal? So we'll start with you, Alex, if you like to attend to these questions and perhaps explore more, if you like.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baabood. Very nice to be with you, with Ali and Danny. I look forward to our conversation. And let me just start off by apologize in advance for having to leave a bit early. I have to leave right just about after 1 o'clock. So forgive me for that, but it was a conflict I couldn't get out of. Look, let me answer the question, Dr. Baabood, by just sort of raising a number of points here that I think sort of, to me at least, characterize where we are in terms of current level of tensions between Iran and the Gulf states, and also on the issue of prospects for de-escalation. When I look at relations right now, and certainly in recent months, I would say with the exception of Bahrain, all the Gulf states are engaging with Iran one way or another to de-escalate. And in fact, in some cases are looking for ways to expand relations. In the case of expansion relations, I think the country of Oman and Qatar stand out. We've seen also in the last few days, the Kuwaitis, after 6 years, as you pointed out, have returned their ambassador to Tehran. The United Emirates, I was reading yesterday, after weeks of delay, but finally I think the new UAE ambassador is to be in Tehran, if he isn't already in Tehran. As you again pointed out, the Saudis are talking to the Iranians. It's a fluctuating process. There hasn't been a major win yet that we can point to. Certainly, to your point about political confidence, We're not at a point yet where, for example, the Saudis are ready to accept an Iranian ambassador, but we are on that track. And certainly the Iranians are very hopeful that might happen. The Saudis far less hopeful, but it's something that it's been worked on today and for months now, which obviously wasn't the case in the years after 2016 when Saudi Arabia and Iran had a diplomatic rupture. Look, in terms of trade and investment, I just want to point this out because, you mentioned, Dr. Baabood, that so far the concentration has been on security matters. But frankly, if the region is going to go in the direction of, more regional consensus and cooperation with the aim of de-escalation, then invariably you would need to look for opportunities in the realm of economics, trade, and so forth. The big test that might be coming up in the next few months is what Iran and Qatar, for example, can do in terms of cooperating around the World Cup that's going to be hosted by Qatar in just a few months' time. A lot of promises about how they're going to, look for ways to cooperate and both that are mutually beneficial for both sides. But I think it's a nice test, and it will show the level of commitment. There's a lot of promises being made and words to that effect, but we need to see concrete evidence of that. All these points, aside, the question we have to ask is what is underlying all of this? What are the underlying factors behind this trend? And to me, it seems pretty obvious that all the Gulf states, including the ones we here in Washington would traditionally classify as hawkish on Iran, countries like Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, no Gulf state really wants to see a military confrontation against Iran by the United States or anybody else for that matter. In fact, they're not even ready to provoke Iran. I think, when you look at the last few weeks after the July summit in Egypt, where regional states with the United States came together and talked about an integrated regional air defense, yes, the Gulf states committed to some of that in terms of words, but we've seen since reluctance to actually do any heavy lifting. And I think that one of the reasons, there are multiple reasons, but one of the reasons is a fear that might provoke the Iranians, right? And I think that's part of a broader hedging strategy that's been in place for some time by the Gulf states, which is to say, we can't necessarily depend on the United States to come to our aid in the event that the Iranians decide to retaliate. I think the lesson from September 2019 with the Iranian attacks on Abqaiq and the missile attack on Abu Dhabi in January of this year, that kind of brought the point home that the Gulf states, whether they like it or not, in any kind of confrontation will be frontline states, and they can't necessarily depend on anyone to come to their aid, including the United States, and therefore they are rethinking anything that might provoke the Iranian side. That doesn't obviously mean the Gulf states do not have reservations about Iranian actions in the region or in the nuclear issue, but I think the Gulf states primarily are concerned about Iranian regional agenda. That's the one that hits them the hardest because of geographic proximity. That's the one they fear the most. And the Iranians have done very little to reassure about their intentions and their use of Islamist militant groups in Arab countries, from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq. And I think that is, in any genuine conversation between Iran and the Gulf states, the issue of Iran's regional agenda has to be on the table. Because without it, I just don't think you get to a point of having enough political confidence to do all these other things that the two sides could do together, for example, in economics, in terms of trade and so forth. The Gulf states, frankly, from what I can tell, do know and appreciate that Iran's not going to pull back away from the region overnight. They're not going to give up on Hezbollah. They're not going to give up on Assad, or they're not going to give up on their Hashd-e-Shaabi investments in Iraq or the Houthis in Yemen. But that doesn't mean, if you're hopeful, that you can't have a conversation with Iran about some adjustments the Iranians could make that might just be enough in terms of reassuring the Gulf to sort of give more momentum to already happening political dialogue that's going on. I think the case of Yemen, where you've had a successful ceasefire since April, is the sort of thing that one wants to see more of. I don't know where people are on how much control Iran has over the Houthis, but whatever it is, there is a political will on the part of the Iranians and the Gulf states to have this ceasefire right now in place. And that, I think, is excellent news. That's good news that should be welcomed, that should be prolonged. In fact, it has been prolonged now till October. But that's the kind of, small step, but important steps that one can take to sort of bring confidence to, as I said, to have a genuine dialogue going forward. I think the challenge for Iran and the Gulf states, and this will be my final set of words, is to turn the goodwill that exists right now. Because there's no doubt about it. There is some goodwill here. You don't just return ambassadors to Tehran if you don't have hope that you might be able to achieve something different this time around, unlike past rounds. But to sort of give this hope and this political momentum an ability to sustain itself, you really need to look for tangible dialogue, and it involves difficult questions. The United States will be part of that conversation, but if I was certainly sitting in Tehran, I would have another hard look at some of the rhetoric that comes from senior Iranian officials that have over the years, frankly, intimidated, frightened the Gulf states. And I think with changes of that nature and looking for opportunities, for example, in Yemen, where a win-win dialogue might be likely, that's exactly what the region needs to be able to go forward and turn a chapter and away from the last 10 years of zero-sum competition, which frankly hasn't served the region well. And I'll stop here, Dr. Baabood.
Thank you, Alex. That's very comprehensive, and you've really given us a very insightful views of how you see this relationship developing and what are the dynamics there. I know you are leaving so early for your own good reasons, I'm sure, and we will want to take an advantage of that before I turn to the next speaker. First of all, I have one or two other questions, but I also want to encourage everybody who's listening or joined us to please submit your questions to the panelists either on the website or on Twitter, or as well on YouTube channel. So please do that, and we will be happy to accommodate your questions and post them to the speakers as much as we can. Alex, what about the JCPOA? What effect is it going to have if you think if there was an agreement there in the next week or so?
Look, I think the best thing that Iran could do it for itself, for the region, and also in any hope to sort of maybe again turn a page, to use a cliche vis-a-vis the Americans, is not to look at any possible new nuclear deal as just limited to the number of centrifuges and the extent of Iran's nuclear program and how much sanctions relief they get. It could be an opportunity to genuinely take a different course going forward. It would be, they don't have to come out and say it loudly, but it would have to be an admission that the past 40-some years of militant Iranian foreign policy, and this might be controversial when I call it militant foreign policy, but I think that's how many of us view it, that hasn't served Iranian national interest. If anything, is isolated Iran. So short answer, Dr. Baabood, is that you turn around and turn a nuclear deal into a stepping stone foundation for a broader dialogue with the Gulf states, with the United States. And it also, hopefully will go in the way of telling Iran that the Gulf states might right now look to Russia, China, and others as part of their foreign policy diversification process, which is natural. The world has evolved, and that's natural. But the Gulf states are not at a point where they're willing to say, United States, we don't need you anymore. We don't need you as a security guarantor. There might be Gulf disappointment in some of the U.S. reactions in recent years to, for example, as I said, the Abqaiq attack. But the Gulf states are still, in terms of security, looking to the United States to provide that security to them. And if the Iranians accept that, again, I think that in itself is a major achievement, because it turns the conversation into something that's far more realistic than what we've heard in terms of slogans from Iran in recent years of, a Middle East without the United States and so forth. And by the way, I'm not even going to bring the sort of more controversial issues, namely Israel. I think so far, from my perspective, the fact that the Iranians have accepted the Abraham Accords in itself is an acceptance that the Gulf states have a sovereign right to choose their own foreign policy partners. And they see in Israel a partner, certainly the UAE does, and Bahrain does, and maybe others will follow. Again, if the Iranians respect that, that in itself is also an achievement. It doesn't necessarily mean Iran's going to accept Israel's right as a member of the United Nations. I wish it would do, but it's unlikely. But even accepting that the Israel and the Gulf states have a relationship doesn't necessarily have to be something Iran needs to confront. I think would be very much welcomed by the Gulf states.
Yeah, I want to press you on this, Alex, before you leave us. And
it's a 1, by the way, but that's fine.
Sorry?
I'm here till 1 o'clock, but that's fine.
Okay. Maybe then we can come back to you a bit later, because I have lots of other pressing questions. And I turn, if I may, now to Dr. Ali and ask you. We've heard what Alex has said. Obviously, not all the Gulf states have the same kind of attitude towards Iran. There are different policies from different countries. There are different relationships, etc. Maybe you explain to us, how do the Gulf states differ in their relationship with Iran, and how does this affect the relationship? Are they playing different roles in this respect, where some countries try to escalate, other countries try to reduce tension? Or is it because the GCC states themselves don't have a policy or unified policy towards Iran? And in this sense, how does maybe take you more towards home and say, how does this Emirati and Saudi dialogue with Tehran now affect how Kuwait looks at the relationship, and also other countries like Kuwait, like Qatar and Bahrain? And what do you think are the concessions that could Riyadh or Abu Dhabi or the GCC as a whole, as a group, make to lower tension with Iran? I will stop here, and I will have other questions, if I may, to challenge you here, Ali.
Okay. First of all, I apologize for the noise. It's because of the construction, my neighbors. To start with, I think the Kuwaiti stance towards Iran, it's not a new policy when it comes to Iran. It's basically since 1976, when Jabir al-Ahmed, he was the Emir of Kuwait at that time, he proposed to create a body that includes the GCC today, plus Iran and plus Iraq. And this body is mainly for trade between these 8 countries. When we talk about the Gulf, Arabian, Persian Gulf, whatever you call it. So the idea was to have a ground that everyone can stand on and start to have business. And business and trade, it's a common language that could bring everyone together in one on one table. So this was the basic idea of Jabir al-Ahmed, and I think it continues to have this idea in the mind of Kuwaitis. When I say Kuwaitis, it's not, and I'm not talking about only the leadership, but also the Kuwaitis, the people themselves, because about 25% of Kuwaitis, they descend from Iran, whether they were Sunnis or Shiites. So the idea is to have a sort of a body that can bring everybody into one place, so they can intermingle between each other. The 80s, it was a tough time with the Iran-Iraq war, and then the 90s we witnessed a good relationship between, not just between Kuwait and Iran, but between the GCC and Iran, and also between United States and Iran, and then September 11, and then later on when things started to change with the nuclear program that emerged in Iran, and since then we witnessed to have a more to suffer in the relationship between the GCC and Iran. And it's not just because of the objection of Saudi on the nuclear program, but also the Israeli objection, and also some other forces, even Russia. They didn't like to have an Iranian neighbor who holds a nuclear program there. So then the idea of having negotiations regarding the nuclear program. And then the story, I think everybody knows it, about the nuclear negotiations between Iran and the United States and the Europeans. When we come back to the GCC, it's obvious. Kuwait and Oman, they have historically they have a good relationship with Iran. Saudi and Bahrain and Qatar before the siege, they had one view towards Iran, but then Qatar, they changed their whole strategy towards Iran with the siege on Qatar, and now it's more active to be a mediator between the West and Iran. And this is what's going on these days. Qatar and Oman trying to be a mediator between the West and Iran. And now we have UAE, which have a very deep relationship when it comes to business and trade, even during the nuclear negotiations and even during the Trump administration. Why Trump administration? Because we know that the United States withdrew from the negotiations at the time of Trump, and then when he waged the maximum pressure campaign against Iran, and the following events that happened with the missile attacks on Aramco oil facilities in September 2019, and then in January 2020, the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. It was a very high tension that happened in the GCC, that neither Kuwait or Oman or Qatar wanted to go through this process, or this uncertain end of relationship with Iran. They didn't want to go towards this way or towards this kind of relationship with Iran. And then the elections in the U.S. and the comeback of the Democrats with Biden, everything changed again, and the United States are coming back to the table to reopen the door for the negotiations with Iran. What should be done? I think this is a good question. I think it is wise not to focus on only one path towards Iran. I'm talking here as a Kuwaiti or as a GCC citizen, or even a policymaker. I think it is wise to use different paths. We can bolster the diplomatic relationship between the GCC countries with Iran, not necessarily all the same level. Kuwait, Oman, they have their embassies are open in Iran. Qatar, the Emir of Qatar, have visited Tehran a few months ago. I think Saudi, they're in a good process of having a dialogue with Iran, with the Iraqi mediator in the middle between Iran and Saudi. Another path besides the diplomacy, I think trade is still a good path and a good way to come to bring all the parties, different parties together and to negotiate on one table. Trade still is a common language that everyone speaks. When it comes to security, and I think the most problematic problem is not Syria anymore. I mean, Syria is not in the agenda of the GCC anymore. It is in the hands of Turkey, Iran, and Russia. But when it comes to the security, it is Yemen. So it has, I mean, they have to find a solution. They have to find a way to solve the Yemeni crisis. To conclude with the GCC and Iranian relationship, I think it's not just the GCC and Iran, but also the American umbrella of the GCC and the Americans with the Iran. And I think the most problematic issue for Iran is trust with the United States. They don't want to go through the same experience at the time of Trump. So what they're looking for now from the United States, is to have guarantees from the U.S. to not to have the same, not to go through the same difficult times at the time of Trump. I'll stop in here, and probably with the Q&A I can go through the other points and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Obviously, we will jump to the role of the United States, which is, of course, a very important player in this relationship, and of course in the region. But before we do that, very quickly, I want to ask you. Alex had mentioned that, for the Gulf states, they want to see de-escalation. They want to see that Iran's role is reduced in some of the hotspots like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and particularly in Yemen. And they want to see less Iranian meddling, if you like, in Arab politics and Arab affairs. On the other hand, what does Iran want from the Gulf states? From the Arab states, from the Gulf states, they know what they want. Less intervention from Iran. What do you think the Iranians want from the Gulf states? And I just want to also add something, that from an Iranian perspective, they will say that we have been approaching the Gulf states for a very long time, asking for dialogue. It's the Gulf states that are refusing to talk to us. We've even initiated, the Hormuz peace endeavor, as it were. The Arab states have not responded. So what does Iran want from the Arabs?
I mean, to be honest, I mean, the GCC, I mean, I don't want to say the Arabs, let me say the GCC, they don't have the leverage to request or to ask Iran to leave Lebanon or Iraq, or to not to support their allies there. I mean, they don't have the leverage to have this request from Iran, because we are seeing what's going on now in Yemen and Lebanon and Iraq and Syria. So GCC by themselves, they cannot really ask for this. I mean, what they can ask for is to have a good relationship with Iran, to have a peaceful nuclear program, not to develop it to be a military nuclear program. What Iran is looking for, I think Iran is gaining by time on the expense of the GCC and even the Arabs, because I mean, day by day they are getting more allies in the region. They have a good relationship with Kuwait. They have a good relationship with Oman. Now Qatar. I mean, the last 5 years they have an extraordinary relationship with Qatar. Saudi. They're going through dialogue between Saudi and Iran, and it's And Iran really didn't went back even one step. They didn't step back in any of these countries, neither Lebanon or Syria or even Yemen. I mean, even Iraq. What's going on these days in Iraq? We don't know where is it gonna go. Which side is it gonna go? How far is Sadr is gonna really? Is he gonna reach his goals in Iraq? We'll see, but I don't see anything really changing towards the Iranian influence in the region. So we don't have that much of leverage to put on Iran. So we have to be more realistic. This is my view.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. And I think that will lead me to the next question to our last but not least speaker, and that is Danielle. If all the pressure that the United States has imposed on Iran and hasn't been able to achieve much, not in terms of either the development in its nuclear program, but also in its relationship with the region. And Iran has been benefiting from some of these, if you like, missteps that have been taken, as people would say it, from the Gulf states themselves and also their partners and allies. What is now the position of the United States? Does it really want to move forward with the JCPOA, as it seems that this is the case? And how does it encourage or discourage the Gulf states to have a rapprochement with Iran and have a much more peaceful region that can incorporate Iran into this relationship?
Well, thank you, Dr. Baabood, and it's lovely to see everybody else. First of all, I hate to start a conversation this way, but I'm going to deny the premise of your question, which is that the United States has taken actions that have really had no impact on Iran's regional or nuclear ambitions. I think when we look back over the last, it's about 35 years now, probably a little more, 36 years. What we see is that the United States has, in fact, slowed down Iran's nuclear program, its missile program. It has done perhaps less, I think, to limit Iran's sponsorship of global terrorism, which, to the contrary, has rather increased and become more sophisticated. But in terms of our own policies, I think it's safe to argue that Iran would now have a nuclear weapons arsenal if the United States had not acted when it did in order to limit Iran's progress forward. Now, that said, can we say exactly where they would be or what they would be doing? No, I don't think we have any idea. And I don't think that we know exactly what Iran's ambitions are to this day. There's a great debate that goes on, I know, both in the Middle East and in the United States and Europe, which is the question of what Iran's true ambitions are. Is Iran interested in actually becoming a nuclear weapons state? In which case, I think there would be, we call that the North Korea option, in which case Iran would be isolated, it would be under even harsher sanctions, it would be a very difficult choice. Or there is what we call the Japan option, which is that Iran remains a threshold nuclear state, as in fact they have said recently that they are. They remain a threshold nuclear state and simply use that status to threaten the region. The Biden administration argues that in helping Iran return to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called Iran deal, the JCPOA, that in fact it is arresting forward movement on Iran's nuclear program. As I'm sure everybody can already tell, I don't actually agree with that. But when we talk about the region and we talk about rapprochement, just to go sort of directly to this question of rapprochement between the Gulf and Iran, I think it's important to step back for a second and analyze this a little bit less on the day-to-day. There's a lot of window dressing around Iranian Gulf relations. It is, do we have an ambassador? Don't we have an ambassador? Do we have dialogue? Don't we have dialogue? Are we doing more trading, less trading, more banking, less banking, more visits, less visits, dialogue, no dialogue? We've all heard this. This is everybody on this screen is an expert in this field. And we have all heard this for many, many, many years, including for those of us who remember well the revolution. It has really been the case since the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. And if we brush aside that window dressing, and I realize that not everybody will appreciate me doing so, but it does have a purpose. If we brush aside that window dressing, what we see is that the fundamental problems that exist between Iran and its neighbors and Iran and the rest of the world aren't going to change. And they have everything to do not with antipathy from Riyadh or from Kuwait or from Abu Dhabi and Dubai. It's nothing to do with that. It has to do with the fact that the nature of the regime and the ideology on which it is based is antithetical to those regimes, okay, and antithetical to us. Now, are there people within the Iranian body politic who wish for more rapprochement, the Rouhanis and others? Sure. Have they prevailed at any point in their history? No. They haven't. Most of them have ended under house arrest if they're lucky, dead if they're not. But two supreme leaders in, I think we are well aware that the ideology of the Islamic Republic is the export of the Islamic Revolution. And the Islamic Revolution is antithetical not simply to Western power, Western leadership, to the state of Israel, but also to the Sunni regimes in its neighborhood. And what we've seen historically is that every moment of peace and quiet, if we can call it that in a relative way, is always followed by moments of opportunism on the part of the regime, in which they seek to take advantage of their operational space, as we would call it, sort of more militarily, in order to undermine, in order to launch attacks against, and in order to otherwise behave in a hostile manner towards the Gulf neighbors. And all we need to do, by the way, is look at Iran's behavior towards Iraq. Okay, Iran is uninterested in Iraq, a fellow Shiite nation, majority Shiite nation, being a peaceful democracy. Right? It is simply uninterested in that. Its proxies have tried to murder the current prime minister. They've tried to attack U.S. soldiers on their soil. They have used their proxies to attack our friends and allies in the GCC. And I see no persuasive reason why that's going to change, because all of this goes down not to the window dressing, not to, oh, we just didn't have time to talk about it. We didn't sit down in a room. We weren't able to discuss these issues. Nothing goes back to that. Everything goes back to the nature of the regime. Look at what's happening in Yemen. Okay, Alex talked a little bit about the the ceasefire that's going on in Yemen, but that ceasefire has been an opportunity for Iran to consolidate the leadership of its proxies, the Houthis, and they're not proxies in exactly the same way that Hezbollah is. So I don't want to try and oversimplify this, but it has been used as an opportunity to arm them, to reinforce their power. And by the way, why is Iran there in the first place, right? Okay, it might be there to support the formerly Zaydi Shiites who were under threat in Yemen, but more likely it's there because of the opportunity it gives them to strike at the soft underbelly of Saudi Arabia. Again, you ask yourself why. Is it because they didn't have an ambassador in Riyadh? Is it because they were unhappy with the Saudi-American relationship? I mean, these things don't make sense. And so when I think about this, and I do from the perspective of history, I step back and simply brush aside some of these questions. I don't think that we are in the midst of a fundamental change. That change will happen when the regime in Iran no longer exists. One last tiny point, and that is the use of the word hedging. It's become very popular in the GCC. Yes, we can't trust America. America is pivoting. You're more concerned about what's going on in Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan. These are going to be your preoccupations. Success have said so. We need to hedge our bets. We need to have a better relationship with Russia, with China. And I think this, again, ignores some fundamental structural truths that people don't want to admit are, in fact, the pillars of the existence of these countries, which is, guess what? Your main threat in the GCC is the Islamic Republic of Iran. I hate to tell you, but if you think that Russia or China is going to come and help you out when you are faced with a threat from them, you got another thing coming. And this is the fundamental truth that kind of gives the lie to all of this hedging, which is, again, the sort of window dressing, tactical maneuvering that does not alter the fundamental strategic truth.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle, for that explanation. And of course, you're entitled to your own views. I just want to ask you that perhaps what you have just explained can explain maybe Iran in the 80s and the 90s, etc. But do you think that the situation hasn't changed? Do you think that Iran hasn't learned anything from the fact that it cannot export its own version of the revolution to other countries, that it cannot succeed in, playing this zero-sum game, and that it has to learn how to live with its regional neighbors? And also, it hasn't learned from the maximum pressure that the United States has imposed on it vis-a-vis the nuclear deal. And do you think that maybe the leadership in Iran, which we have no say in how we can change them, this is up to the Iranian people, but do you think that that regime hasn't come to a point where it really now wants to survive? We want to see Iran being stable, being prosperous, and wants to play a very constructive role in the region and also in the global community. Do you see any silver lining there, that perhaps we could hedge our or bet our money on it for future relationship in the region, or this is going to continue as long as this regime in Iran continues like this?
Well, Doctor, thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to have my own opinions about such things. That made me laugh really hard. Yes, I am entitled to my own opinions, but I don't think that they are based solely on opinion. I think they are actually based on fact. Look, if we just look at what the Islamic Republic has been engaged in over the last, you can call it the 21st century if you'd like, the 20 years. Maybe you'd rather talk about the last 10 years. We could talk about since 2015, since the Obama administration signed the JCPOA. It's not a moderation of Iranian behavior. And again, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's much harder to affect what goes on inside Iran. We don't have a say, as much as I wish we did. We don't have a say in who rules Iran. I don't think that there's any evidence since that time that the Iranian regime has moderated its ambitions. To the contrary, while I think that their dream, if you want to call it that, of the export of the revolution has changed shape since 1979, I think it's actually become a much more successful enterprise. It's an enterprise that other governments have copied. It was something that the Saudis tried in tentatively supporting groups like Al-Qaeda and Sunni extremist groups. But if we talk about what Iran has been up to vis-a-vis Syria, vis-a-vis the Houthis, vis-a-vis Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, what they've been doing in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in Sudan, let alone inside Saudi Arabia or Iraq, I think what we see is that they have accelerated their use of proxies, that when they have more money, they provide more arms and better arms and more money to their proxies, and that their proxies continue to attack Iran's perceived enemies. apace. In fact, we saw the major escalation in Yemen after the signature of the JCPOA, not before it. So again, Iran proceeds on these different tracks. And I think that if we try to argue to ourselves that they have evolved, that they now are more interested in regime protection, I would say to you that I think that their fears about regime security, which were very, very serious in the first decade of this century, have diminished to a certain extent, and that they have begun once again to focus externally. Now, does this mean there aren't continued battles? No, Alex will tell you more intelligently than I can that there's still a tension between the IRGC, between the clerics, and between the various factions inside Iran. It is not a monolith. But the arguments that take place are not about what Iran's external posture should be. They are about what Iran should look like internally. They are about a resistance economy versus an integrated economy. They're not about whether we should support Hezbollah or the Houthis, or whether the regime in Saudi Arabia is our enemy, as are the Gulf states. So, again, I think that these are the truths that remain fairly constant, although you can certainly point to nuances in their behavior.
Thank you, Daniel. I want to take advantage of Alex before he leaves us in a few minutes, if I may, and say to Alex, what do you say to this? I mean, what Danielle is saying is very powerful view, and I'm sure many people prescribe to that. And there are, of course, indications to say so. But do you think there are any nuances that perhaps we could take in the Gulf? That we could maybe look for a future relationship where Iran is actually, a respected regional players that it should be, and we want to deal with it, and we want to trade with it, and we want to have good relationship with it. What are the, the silver lining there that we should look for in this relationship, and and for the future of this relationship?
Now look, I mean, a lot of the points that Danny just made is hard to argue with. I mean, the nature of the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic since 1979 is what it is. I mean, it's one that wants to change the region, its image. I mean, don't take my word for it. Ayatollah Khomeini said it in 79, and since 1989, Ayatollah Khamenei has been saying it. So there is that sort of we know best and follow us and we'll take you to good places approach, which frankly, the region doesn't want to hear. What they want to hear is a different kind of a language of looking for win-win. And Danny says, well, that's not going to happen. And she might very well be right, that it is maybe just hope on the part of many, maybe even myself, that, you're hoping that they're going to change, but they're not going to change. Where I probably will just, raise the issue, and I have to be very humble here because I really don't know. But look, 1979 is 43 years ago. And Khamenei might live another 15 years. Some of the Shia clerics live past 100 years. Who knows? He might be around for a long time, but he might not. And this is a challenge for the ruling class. It's certainly the second generation, the ones in their 60s, right, waiting to take over, to decide which way they want to go. Because I think, the idea that the revolution has been exported successfully in a way that has advanced Iranian national interest is the argument that very few people can make. Yes, you could say that the Houthis, the proxies around the region have been a success, but only seen from an ideological point of view. They have an advanced Iranian national interest. Iran's not making any more money in the region today because they have Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah is not creating any jobs in Iran. So it really goes back to the issue of what is the national interest of Iran? Who's benefiting from Iranian foreign policy? If you look at the protest in Iran, in the country right now, this week as we speak, that is suffering from lack of water shortage, your average Iranians who might not have the power to replace the regime by force, but certainly are not happy with its foreign policy performance because they don't see any, connection between what the regime is doing in the region and their livelihood. All they see is things are getting worse. So I just do ask the question because I think it's valid. Will be there smart enough people, certainly after Khamenei, because Khamenei as a man is too stubborn to change course. and you probably can throw the leadership and the Revolutionary Guards in the same category. They're not going to change course, but there are people who eventually will replace them, and they have a choice to make. They can put Iranian national interests first, look for ways to cooperate, coexist with the neighboring states, or they can stay the course and hope for the best. I just don't know if they can. I don't know how long they can sit on top of a very restless Iranian population of 85 million people. That is going to be their challenge. And if they want to, if want to tackle the anger, they need to make some serious changes across the board, not just domestic politics, but also in terms of what doing in foreign policy, and look to make friendships, partnerships, as opposed to just creating more costly, foreign policy decisions, frankly, that has not served the national interest. Again, I think it's key here: national interest versus the ideological aspirations of a small group of people who run the Islamic Republic today.
And that again maybe leads me to another question: to what extent, Alex, and maybe Daniela could come into this, is what the ideological factor play into this? To what extent does it really go? What does Iran really need? Is it hegemonic control of the region, or spreading of its ideology? We don't want to get into that, but the same kind of ideological leaning, Shiites, etc. What does it really need, you think, from the region?
Well, I don't think there is one sort of approach. It's much more opportunistic than that. The ideological part that I was describing probably fits much better in terms of their approach to the Muslim states, the regional states. Elsewhere, if you look broadly, who are Iran's biggest allies on the global stage? Russian nationalist Vladimir Putin and the Communist Party of China. I mean, there's hardly any ideological, overlap, but that's how it works for them best on the global scale. On a regional level, I would wish they would take such a pragmatic view and deal with countries in the Gulf, for example, much more realistically. Don't ask the impossible. I mean, you were talking about the Hormuz Initiative. I mean, that's been one that's been floating around since the 1990s. One of the things that is all sort of written between the lines, which is a non-starter for the Gulf states, is that, they want the extra-regional powers out, namely the United States. The Iranians are asking the impossible for the Gulf states, which are by and large small, financially very wealthy, but also very insecure. And they just don't have that political trust in Iran to say, yeah, we'll come with you, Iran, and let's get the Americans out of here. It's not going to happen. So again, if the Iranian side was realistic enough to look at the world from the vantage point of view, say, sitting in Abu Dhabi or Riyadh or Kuwait City, I think their ability to sort of push forward with the dialogue, which I think a real dialogue can happen. Again, I hear what Danny said about whether an ambassador is in a capital or not is window dressing, and to some extent she's right. But it is also an indication after 6 years, you send a senior diplomat to Tehran, at least you're saying, look, let's maybe have another round of discussion. And if that happened, then I would hope the Iranian side would put national interest of Iran ahead of the ideology of the Islamic Republic, which is genuinely problematic for the Iranian people and certainly for the region.
Thank you. Danielle, do you want to add to anything on this?
I really, look, I think Alex is right. I guess I've never seen any indication that the regime is interested in the interests of its own people. The resistance economy is characterized by the charities and the families of Ayatollah Khamenei and his cronies having possibly billions of dollars, while average Iranians struggle economically for jobs, for food, for education, for drink. I've never seen any indication that in that sense they're anything different from the kind of kleptocracy that, for example, Russia is. But ideologically, in addition, again, all I need to do is look at Syria and say to myself, is a regime that would be complicit in the death of 500,000 Syrians actually a regime that's interested in peaceful rapprochement with its neighbors? again, I mean, I've never gone wrong being a cynic and a pessimist about the Middle East. I'm probably at my old age never going to. I would like to be a little bit optimistic. Right now, I don't see any reason to be. I also agree with Alex. I think this is a very important issue that I didn't mention and that doesn't get enough attention. My colleague Fred Kagan talks about this. He began as an expert on Napoleonic Russia, and then has done a lot of work on Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. And one of the things he says is, you cannot expect change when the first generation of the revolution remains present. Change comes when the revolution has lost its personal touch and becomes merely a tool of power and of history for that next generation. We're not there yet. And it will be very interesting to see how that next generation changes. It could get better, but I also think it could get worse. I'm always finding that black cloud.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much. A pleasure to be with you. Sorry I'm leaving early. Thank you again.
Alex, thank you very much for joining us and for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Wish you good luck.
Pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Good to see you again.
Bye.
Thank you. If you may turn to Ali, if you want to add something at this point.
Yeah, please. I mean, I'm speaking as a citizen of the GCC, and I'm thinking of what you just said, Danny, about Iran. So the question is, how to deal with Iran? Shall we go and continue on the maximum pressure campaign with Iran? And where is it gonna take us? I mean, what is the end of the maximum pressure? Or should we take another way to deal with Iran, which it requires patience. It requires more negotiations, understanding. I mean, dealing with each other, having different kind of relationships, intellectual, academic, business, diplomatic. I mean, are we willing to have a war with Iran? I mean, this is a big question. I don't think anyone in the Gulf would love to go through any of these scary scenarios in the GCC. I mean, it's not a game. It's not. I mean, to have like such kind of relationship with Iran. So, what options we have here to deal with Iran? Okay, let's say I will agree with with your description of the Iranian regime, but how shall I deal with them? Should I antagonize them, or should I try to change them from inside? Should I deal with them? Should I wait for things to change? Should I mean, so many questions, and these questions are from a person who's living on the line. I mean, who's watching everything every day, what's going on, and its neighbors. So, I mean, I'm just throwing these questions. I mean, for myself and for the audience as well, and for you.
Do you want to respond, Danielle, or should we go on to other questions? Sure.
Sure. Let me try and respond briefly. We only have a couple more minutes, and I know we have a question from the audience, and I'm going to leave that question to Ali because I'm not sure I can answer it. Look, I hear what you're saying. First of all, don't think to yourself that you're not at war with Iran. Iran is at war with you. Ask Mohammed bin Salman whether Iran is at war with Saudi Arabia. Ask the people who were in Abqaiq. Ask the people who were struck by the drones in the United Arab Emirates. that is a war. It's not an open war, and I don't think Iran is interested in an open war in the region for very obvious reasons. Iran didn't even fully commit its troops to Syria, where it was truly and strangely committed to the survival of Bashar al-Assad. So, yes, I hear what you're saying. I understand. I think that the problem is that once you've spent as long as many of us have looking at Iran, one of the things that you see is that in good times, the Iranians do this. In bad times, the Iranians do this. In fact, Iranian behavior does not change dramatically. What changes is the behavior of the people around them. And these are all efforts to propitiate the Iranians and to hope, I think, that if they feel less threatened, this is the argument that the Obama administration made, right? If they felt less threatened, if they felt less encircled, if they had more money, if they didn't think that we were trying to overthrow them, then they would stop doing some of these things, which are in fact coming from a place of defensiveness. That's what Rob Malley argues, our senior Iran negotiator. That's not right. Okay? That's not what this regime is about. And all you need to do is listen to them. Just one last word, one last phrase on this. I believe people when they tell me that that they seek to destroy another country. I believe leaders when they tell me that their doctrine is implacably opposed to certain kinds of regimes. I believe them because they're telling me. When Putin said he was going to invade Ukraine years ago, I believed him. When the Chinese say they're going to take Taiwan, I believe them. I believe the Iranians. There's no reason why you should. That doesn't mean it should dictate everything that you do, but you might as well believe what they're telling you is their attitude towards your country, because that is the problem. Does that give you lots of options? Should you go to war with them? No, I think your position is a limited one, but I believe them.
Thank you for that. I just want to take the conversation before we leave and answer some of the questions that were raised from the audience. And we have a very important question from Dr. Jassim Hussain, who's a former member of the Bahraini parliament. And Dr. Jassim is asking about what role could Israel play in this GCC-Iran rapprochement, and can it really affect Manama's or Abu Dhabi's decision to escalate or de-escalate with Tehran? And I think there was a follow-up to that, and that is, I think that was the question. I think he also asked something else. Why is Bahrain lagging behind in the outreach to Iran? When we see, UAE, we see Saudi Arabia is even having a dialogue. Why Bahrain is lagging behind? So these are the three main questions that came from Dr. Jassim Hussain, who's a former member of Bahraini parliament. And I'll pose it to both of you if you want to have a go at it. Ali, you want to go first?
Sure.
Danielle is pointing. Yeah.
Okay, so when it comes to Israel, I mean, Israel, they have their own interests, so it's not necessary. I mean, we will share the same interests with Israel when it comes to Iran. Israel are pushing the United States to probably, I mean, if it's possible for them, they will wage a war, I mean, supported by the United States. But I mean, the United States, it's not in their interest to have any kind of war in the Middle East since the Afghanistan and the Iraqi wars. So it's not, I mean, if they're willing to do this, or Manama or Abu Dhabi are willing to do this, so I don't think so. I mean, Abu Dhabi, they have a very good relationship when it comes to business. Manama, yes, I mean, they have a serious issue with Iran, but I mean, Manama, I mean, they have their own issues, and it's understandable. but not necessarily all the other GCC countries. They have the same issues with Iran. And when it comes to the Bahraini lagging, I mean, it's about the leverage. It's about the influence of each state in the GCC.
I know that Danielle is going to leave us. Thank you, Ali. But and she has something else to go for. But very quickly, do you see there is any, a reset here? Are we talking about some kind of, a de-escalation that could lead to a rapprochement and more engagement with Iran in the future, or is it going to be the same status quo?
Yes, please forgive me. I do have to hop off. Look, I think the issue here is not that the United States or Israel, frankly, is not open to a change in Iran. It is that there's very little that we have seen that will indicate that there is a change in Iran that is impending. Anything that we can do to encourage that would be fantastic for the people of Iran, for the people of the Middle East, most importantly for the people of Iran. But I don't know what that is. And regimes that are of a particular stripe do not change their stripes, at least not this soon, this easily. I think we have a continued long road to hoe ahead of us. I am waiting to see what happens when Ayatollah Khamenei dies. I am shocked that he's lived this long. I'm waiting to see what happens when he dies. I think that will be an indication of where Iran is headed in the future. And perhaps, I hope, that will be an opportunity for all of us. Thank you so much for having me, by the way. And I really enjoyed the conversation and learned a lot. I'm sorry I have to run.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your views and insights. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Ali. There are lots of questions that we want to address to you, but I'm sure there may be other opportunities. And the time has, we've run out of time, unfortunately. I want to also thank all, of course, the speakers, but also all of those who joined us on this panel, and also those people who posed some questions. I'm sorry if we couldn't deal with all of them because of time, but hopefully there will be other opportunities. Wish you all a good day or a good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much. And thank you.